I am beyond good and evil. I will be avenged. Lucifer dwells in us all. That is it. Richard Ramirez was 29 when he spoke these words in Southern California courtroom in 1989. He had just been sentenced to death following the conviction of 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, and 11 sexual assaults and 14 burglaries. Richard Ramirez was born Ricardo Leyva Munoz Ramirez in El Paso, Texas on the 29th of February 1960. He was the youngest of 5 children born to Mexican immigrants. His father, Julian, a Mexican national and former policeman who later became a laborer on the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway, was an alcoholic who was prone to fits of anger that often resulted in physical abuse towards his wife and children. His mother worked at a boot factory where she was exposed to chemical fumes during her pregnancies. This may have attributed to birth defects her children had ranged from respiratory difficulty to bone deformities. At the age of 2, Richard had a dresser fall on top of him, knocking him unconscious. He suffered a deep cut on his forehead and scar remained visible as an adult. At the age of 5, he was also knocked unconscious by a swing in a park playground. It is interesting to note here that psychologists believe that head trauma may lead to extreme forms of violence. A recent study conducted by the University of Glasgow and published in the Journal of Violent and Aggressive Behavior looked into the neurodevelopment and psychological risk factors in serial killers and mass murderers. It was the first ever analysis of all available literature, i.e. books, journals, legal files, news reports, electronic documents about serial killers and mass murderers. Our findings tentatively indicated that these extreme forms of violence may be the result of highly complex interaction of biological, psychological, and sociological factors, the report reads. Potentially a significant portion of mass or serial killers may have had neurodevelopment disorders such as ASD or autism spectrum disorder or head injury. Out of the 239 eligible killers used in the study, 28% were found to have definite, high probable, or possible ASD. Compare that to the 1 in 100 people in the UK have ASD. 21% have suffered a definite or suspected head injury, whilst 55% of those with ASD and or a head injury had experienced psychological stressors such as a significant trauma event during childhood, i.e. a violent or sexual abuse, death of a close family member, parental divorce, etc. As an example, the following serial killers suffered head trauma as a child: Dennis Rader, Henry Lee Lucas, Pete Sutcliffe, Glenn Edward Rogers, Ed Gein, Albert Fish, David Berkowitz, Alexander Pushkin, and John Wayne Gacy. Richard suffered from epilepsy when he was younger, experiencing between 1 and 2 dozen petit mal seizures, now called absence seizures, until his early teens. At the age of 7, Richard would talk of having these vivid dreams about monsters and seeing them running through the garden, something that frightened him very much. It was later said that this may have been part of his seizures. As a 12-year-old, Richard, or Richie as he was known to his family, had strongly influenced by his older cousin Miguel Mike Ramirez, a decorated Green Beret combat veteran who himself had already become a serial killer and a rapist in Vietnam, who had often boasted of his brutal war crimes during the Vietnam War, and shared a Polaroid photos of his victims both during and after his crimes with his younger cousin Richard, including Vietnamese women he had raped, murdered, and dismembered. Many of the women and girls in the photos are shown to have been bound to trees with rope before Mike had raped them, and afterwards, having been killed by him, decapitated them with a machete. In some of these photos, Mike posed with the severed heads of the women he had sexually assaulted and murdered. Richard would later state, while incarcerated, that he was never shocked or repulsed by these images and the stories of his cousin's wartime atrocities in Vietnam, but that they had fascinated him. Richard, who had begun smoking marijuana and drinking alcohol at the age of 10, bonded with Mike through the two smoking joints and drinking beers, while Richard listened to his elder cousin's gruesome war stories. Mike taught his young cousin some of the military skills such as killing with stealth. Around this time, Ramirez began to seek escape from his father's violent temper and sleeping at a local cemetery. Richard was present on May 4, 1973, when his cousin Mike fatally shot his wife Jessie in the face with a handgun during a domestic argument. Like the graphic photos and the stories of his cousin's war crimes in Vietnam, Richard would later remark while in prison that seeing this event unfold wasn't traumatic for him in any traditional sense, but rather, witnessing a violent death for the first time had deeply fascinated him. After the shooting, Richard becomes sullen and withdrawn from his family and his peers. Later that year, Richard moved in with his older sister Ruth and her husband Roberto, an obsessive peeping Tom who had took Richie along with his nocturnal exploits. By the time Ramirez had turned 14 in the early of 74, he began using LSD frequently and cultivated an interest in Satanism and the occult. Mike was found not guilty of Jesse's murder by reason of insanity, largely thought to be due to his presumed severe wartime PTSD from his time serving in Vietnam, and was released in 1977, after 4 years of incarceration at the Texas State Mental Hospital. His influence over Richard continued, and it is known that Mike resumed occasionally bonding with Richard over the shared use of drugs and alcohol, and that he sometimes accompanied Richard and Roberto on their nighttime voyeuristic walks, where they would spy on women in nearby areas without the knowledge through the windows. The adolescent Ramirez began to meld his burgeoning sexual fantasies with graphic violence, including forced bondage, murder, manipulation, and rape. While still in school, he took a job at a local Holiday Inn where he used his passkey to rob sleeping patrons. On at least one occasion, Ramirez sexually fondled and molested 2 children in an elevator at the hotel, but was never reported or prosecuted for this act. His employment ended abruptly after Ramirez attempted to rape a woman in her hotel room, before her husband returned to find them. Although the husband beat Ramirez senselessly at the scene, criminal charges were dropped when the couple, who lived out of state, declined to return to Texas to testify against him. Ramirez had dropped out of Jefferson High School in the 9th grade, and at the age of 22 in 1982, he moved to California where he settled permanently. It was around this time that Ramirez began to use cocaine, which would very quickly become his main substance of choice, and sometime shortly after this began, Ramirez would commit theft and burglaries to get the money that he would use to buy more cocaine. Ramirez would live anywhere from San Francisco to Los Angeles County during his time living in the state before being incarcerated. He was also known to frequent travel between the northern and southern areas of the state of California, both before and during his year-long crime spree. In an interview with A&E, Dr. Scott Bond, criminologist and author of Why We Love Serial Killers, The Circus Appeal of the World's Most Savage Killers, was asked if Ramirez's childhood trauma and abuse could have led to him becoming a serial killer. Dr. Scott stated, "There's always a question of whether serial killers are born or made. I believe Ramirez was a sociopath as opposed to a psychopath. A psychopath is absolutely incapable of feeling any normal range of emotions, and that was the case with, say, Ted Bundy and John Wayne Gacy, the killer clown. Ramirez, on the other hand, was prone to emotional outbursts, very spontaneous and volatile. A sociopath is developed through life experiences and manufactured in society. Also, unlike Bundy and Gacy, who had planned their murders meticulously, Ramirez randomly picked homes to break into. A psychopath just wouldn't do that. A psychopath needs control. So yes, all these factors, I believe, contribute. But what seems to happen with some serial killers, and it happened with, say, Jeffrey Dahmer, BTK, and Bundy, is that right around puberty, sex and violence fuse in their minds and they become aroused by violence. When his cousin showed him those photographs, Ramirez became sexually aroused, and that was right around the age of 13. According to Philip Carlo's biographical crime book, also titled The Night Stalker, Ramirez's family were the only thing that ever made him feel any remorse for what he had done. Somewhere, there were people who loved and cared for him deeply, the book reads, describing the reason why Ramirez did not ever want to be caught or publicly linked to the string of crimes he left in his wake. So now we move into the victims. DNA links Richard Ramirez and a possible second unknown attacker to the April 10, 1984 killing of May Linda Luang, whose body was found hanging over a pipe in the basement of an apartment building at 765 O'Farrell Street, the police had said. The girl was with her 8-year-old brother when she lost a dollar bill and went looking for it. The boy wandered away and then came back to the basement and found his sister dead. Police said she had been beaten, raped, and stabbed. Richard's first confirmed victim. On June 28, 1984, 79-year-old Jenny Vincow was found brutally murdered in an apartment in Glassell Park, Los Angeles. She had been stabbed repeatedly in the neck, head, and chest while asleep in her bed, and her throat had been slashed so deeply that she was almost decapitated. Ramirez's fingerprint was found on a mesh screen he had removed to gain access through the open window. This would go on to establish his pattern of breaking into homes, committing particularly vicious murders, and frequently burglarizing his victims before and after killing them, which was mainly to support his cocaine addiction and pay his rent. On March 17, 1985, Ramirez attacked 22-year-old Maria Hernandez outside her home in Rosemead, shooting her in the face with a .22 caliber handgun after she pulled into her garage. She survived when the bullet ricocheted off her keys that she had held in her hand as she lifted to protect herself. Hernandez had played dead until Ramirez left the scene. Inside the house, her roommate Dale Yushi Okazaki, age 34, heard a gunshot and ducked behind the counter when she saw Ramirez enter. When she raised her head to go look to see what happened, Ramirez shot Ozaki once in the forehead, killing her instantly. Within an hour of the Rosemead home invasion, Richard had pulled a 30-year-old Shai Lian Veronica Yu out of her car in Monterey Park, shot her twice with the .22, and fled. She was pronounced dead on arrival at the hospital. The two murders, an attempted third in a single day, attracted extensive coverage to the news media, who dubbed the attacker, described as a curly hair with bulging eyes and wide-spaced rotting teeth, the walking killer, and the Valley intruder. On March 27, 1985, Ramirez entered a home that he had burglarized a year earlier just outside of Whittier, California, at approximately 2 a.m., and killed the sleeping Vincent Charles Zazara, age 64, with a gunshot to his head from the .22. Zazara's wife, Maxine, aged 44, was awakened by the gunshot, and Ramirez beat her and bound her hands while demanding to know where her valuables were. While he ransacked the room, Maxine escaped her bonds and retrieved a shotgun from under the bed, which was not loaded. This infuriated Ramirez, and he had shot her 3 times with the .22, then fetched a large carving knife from the kitchen. He mutilated her body by stabbing her several times, then removed her eyes with a knife and placed them in a jewelry box, which he had took when he left, and kept them at his apartment as a souvenir until his arrest. The autopsy determined that the mutilations were post-mortem. Vincent and Maxine's bodies were then discovered by their son Peter. Ramirez had left footprints from a pair of Avia sneakers in the flower beds, which the police had photographed and cast. This was virtually the only evidence that the police had at the time. Bullets found at the scene were matched to those found in previous attacks, and the police determined that a serial killer was now at large. On May 14, 1985, Ramirez returned to Monterey Park and entered the home of Bill Doy, age 66, and his disabled wife Lillian, age 56. Surprising Doy in his bedroom, Ramirez shot him in the face with the .22 as Doy went for his own handgun. After beating the mortally wounded man into unconsciousness, Ramirez entered Lillian's bedroom, bound her with thumb cuffs, then raped her after he had ramshackled the home for valuables. Bill Doy died of his injuries while in the hospital. On the night of May 29, 1985, Ramirez drove a stolen car to Monrovia and stopped at a house of Ma Bell, age 83, and her disabled sister Florence Lang, age 81. Finding a hammer in the kitchen, he bludgeoned and bound Lang in her bedroom, then bound and bludgeoned Bell before using an electrical cord to shock the woman. After raping Lang, he used Bell's lipstick to draw the satanic pentagram symbol on her thigh, as well as in the walls of both bedrooms. The women were found 2 days later, alive but comatose and critically injured. Bell later died of her injuries in the hospital. The next day, Ramirez drove the same car to Burbank and snuck into the home of Carol Kyle, age 42. At gunpoint, he bound Kyle and her 11-year-old son with handcuffs, then ransacked the house. He released Kyle to direct him to where the family's valuables were, then he raped her repeatedly. Ramirez also repeatedly ordered her not to look at him, telling her at one point that he would cut her eyes out. He fled the scene after retrieving the child from the closet and binding the two together again with some pair of handcuffs. On the night of July 2, 1985, he drove a stolen car to Arcadia and randomly selected the house of Mary Louise Cannon, age 75, a widowed grandmother. After quickly entering Cannon's house, he found her asleep in a bedroom. He bludgeoned her into unconscious with a lamp and then stabbed Cannon to death using a 10-inch butcher knife he got from her kitchen. Ramirez repeatedly stabbed Cannon's bottom after she had already dead. She was found dead at the scene 2 days later. On July 5, 1985, Ramirez broke into a home of Sierra Madre and bludgeoned the 16-year-old Whitney Bennett with a tire iron as she slept in her bedroom. After searching in vain for a knife in the kitchen, Ramirez tried to strangle the girl with a telephone cord. He stated that he was startled to see electrical sparks emanating from the cord, and when his victim began to breathe, he fled the house believing that Jesus Christ had entered and saved her. Bennett survived the staged beating and attempted strangulation, although 478 stitches were required to close the lacerations in her scalp. On July 7, 1985, Ramirez burglarized the home of Joyce Lucille Nelson, age 60, in Monterey Park. Finding her asleep on her living room couch, he beat her to death by stomping on her face repeatedly. A shoe print from the Avia sneaker was left imprinted on her face. After cruising 2 other neighborhoods, he returned to Monterey Park and chose the home of Sophie Dickman, age 63. Ramirez assaulted and handcuffed Dickman at gunpoint, attempting to rape her and stole her jewelry. When she swore to him that he had taken everything of value, he told her to swear to Satan. On July 20th, 1985, Ramirez purchased a machete before driving a stolen Toyota to Glendale, California. He chose the home of Leila Keating, age 66, and her husband Maxon, age 68. He burst into the sleeping couple's bedroom and hacked them with the machete, then killed them with shots to the head from a .22. He further mutilated their bodies with a machete before robbing the house of valuables. After quickly fencing the stolen items from the Keating residence, Ramirez drove to Sun Valley. At approximately 4:15 a.m., he broke into the home of the Kavanaugh family. He shot the sleeping Changarong in the head with a .25 caliber handgun, killing him instantly, then repeatedly raped and beat Sumkid. He bound the couple's 8-year-old son before dragging Sumkid around the house to reveal the location of the valuable items, which then he stole. During his assault, he demanded that she swear to Satan that she was not hiding any money from him. On August 6, 1985, Ramirez drove to Northbridge and broke into the home of Chris and Virginia Peterson. He crept into the bedroom, startling Virginia, age 27, and shot her in the face with a .25. He then shot Chris in the neck and attempted to flee. Chris fought back while avoiding being hit 2 more times during the struggle before Ramirez managed to escape. The couple had survived their injuries. On August 8, 1985, Ramirez drove a stolen car to Diamond Bar, California, and chose the home of Sakina Abawath, age 27, and her husband Elias, age 31. Sometime after 2:30 a.m., he entered the house and went into the master bedroom. He instantly killed the sleeping Elias with a shot to the head from the .25. He handcuffed and beat Sakina while forcing her to reveal the location of the family's jewelry, and then he brutally raped her. He repeatedly demanded that she swear to Satan that she would not scream during his assaults. When the couple's 3-year-old son entered the bedroom, Ramirez tied the child up and then continued to rape Sakina. After Ramirez left the home, Sakina untied her son and sent him to the neighbors for help. At this time, Ramirez had been following the media coverage of his crime, so he left Los Angeles and headed to San Francisco. On August 18, 1985, he entered the home of Peter and Barbara Pan. He shot the sleeping Peter, age 66, in the temple with a .25, which killed him instantly. He then beat and sexually assaulted Barbara, age 62, before shooting her in the head and leaving her for dead. At the crime scene, Ramirez used lipsticks to scrawl the pentagram into the phrase "Jack the Knife" on the bedroom wall. Ramirez again left a shoe print at the scene that detective discovered and matched to a specific pair of Avia shoes that wasn't common at the time. Lead detectives Frank Salerno and Gil Carrillo, who contributed to the Netflix's documentary Night Stalker: The Hunt for a Serial Killer, contacted the manufacturer of Avia shoes and were able to retrieve the soles. Upon a discovery of the make and distribution across the United States, only 6 of them had been enlisted at the size 11.5, with 5 of them shipped to locations in Arizona and 1 shipped to a shoe store in LA. It was evident that the 1 pair of its size and kind in the state of California then belonged to Ramirez. When it was discovered that the ballistics and shoe print evidence from the Los Angeles crime scenes matched the Pan crime scene, San Francisco's then mayor, Dwayne Feinstein, divulged the information, including the gun caliber, in the televised press conferences. The leak infuriated the detectives in the case, as they knew the killer would be following the media coverage, which gave him an opportunity to destroy critical forensic evidence. Indeed, Ramirez, who had been watching the press, dropped his size 11.5 Avia sneakers over the side of the Golden Gate Bridge at night and remained in the area for a few days more before heading back to LA. The next big break in the case came in August 24, 1985. Ramirez traveled 50 to 76 miles south of Los Angeles to Mission Viejo and broke into the Mediterranean Village apartment of Bill Carnes, 29, and his fiancée, Inez Erickson, age 27. Ramirez shot Carnes in the head and then raped Erickson. He demanded that she swear her love for Satan and afterwards forced her to perform oral intercourse on him. He then tied her up and left. Erickson struggled to the window and saw that Ramirez's car was driving. She was able to give a description of both Ramirez and his orange Toyota station wagon. A teenager had later identified the car from the news report and wrote down half of its license plate number. The stolen car was found on August 28th, and police were able to obtain one fingerprint that was on the mirror of the vehicle. From that print, they identified Richard Ramirez. They issued an APB for Ramirez, and his mugshots were shown all over national TV. The next day, Ramirez's picture was on the cover of every major newspaper in the state and on every TV news bulletin. Ramirez had no idea of this until he walked into a liquor store and seen himself staring at him from the day's newspaper. Ramirez panicked as other customers realized that it was him. He ran 2 miles in the next 12 minutes, then decided to steal a car. Unfortunately for Ramirez, he was in a particularly tough neighborhood and ended up being rescued by the police as he was being brutally beaten by local thugs. The night stalker had been caught. One thing we need to note here is that Richard had horrible dental hygiene. According to the Crime Mag, Richard Ramirez did injustice to his own oral hygiene from the early age. He apparently had a diet heavy on soft drinks and sugary foods and wasn't one to brush his teeth too often. He never brushed his teeth, said Ray Garcia, who knew Ramirez growing up. I used to tell him, man, close your mouth or brush your teeth. Ramirez's tooth-destroying breakfast of champions? Sugar-coated cereal washed down with an ice-cold Coca-Cola. On top of these poor habits, he had added heavy cocaine addiction as an adult and caused several of them to fall out. Forensic dentists who testified at his trial found that 9 of his teeth showed signs of decay and many others just simply weren't there anymore. Women's Health reported that some of his victims who survived his attack said specifically remembering his terrible teeth from their horrific ordeals. Lillian Doy, the 56 woman who was raped by Ramirez in May of '85 and whose husband Bill was murdered during the home invasion, told police the suspect had really bad teeth. Another survivor, Sumkid Kavanath, who was also raped and beaten by Ramirez, and her husband was Chinarong, was murdered during the break-in, had noted the same thing. This had helped prosecutors ultimately secure the conviction, although his father attempted to provide an alibi for Ramirez, saying that he was in the hometown of El Paso, Texas, during the time when some of the murders were committed. A California dentist was able to prove him wrong, saying that he was with him at the time in Los Angeles. Jury selection of the case started on July 22, 1988, and on September 20, 1989, he was found guilty of 13 counts of murder, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries. During the penalty phase of the trial on November 7, 1989, he was sentenced to die in California's gas chamber. The trial of Richard Ramirez was one of the most difficult and longest criminal trials in American history. Nearly 1,600 prospective jurors were interviewed. More than 100 witnesses testified, and while a number of these witnesses had a difficult time recalling certain facts 4 years after their crimes, others were quite certain of the identity of Richard Ramirez. On August 3, 1988, the Los Angeles Times reported that some jail employees overheard Ramirez planning to shoot the prosecutor with a gun, which Ramirez had intended on having smuggled into the courtroom. Consequently, a metal detector was then installed outside the courtroom and intensive searches were conducted on people entering. On August 14th, the trial was interrupted because one of the jurors, Phyllis Singletary, did not arrive to the courtroom. Later that day, she was found shot to death in her apartment. The jury was terrified. They could not help but wonder if Ramirez had somehow directed this event from inside his prison cell, and if he could reach other jury members. What about them? However, Ramirez was not responsible for Singletary's death. She had been shot and killed by her boyfriend, who had later killed himself with the same weapon in a hotel. The alternative jury was replaced. Singletary was too frightened to return to her home. By the time of the trial, Ramirez had had fans who were writing him letters and paying him visits. Since 1985, freelance magazine editor Doreen Loy wrote him nearly 75 letters during his incarceration. In 1988, he proposed to her, and on October 3, 1996, they were married in California's San Quentin State Prison. Loy had stated that she would commit suicide when Ramirez was executed. On August 7, 2006, Ramirez's first round of state appeals ended successfully when the California Supreme Court upheld his convictions and death sentences. On September 7, 2006, the California Supreme Court denied his request for a rehearing. Richard had additional appeals pending until the time of his death. A self-described Satanist, Ramirez made various references to Satan during his legal proceedings. He had notably drew a pentagram on his palm. His trial began in early 1989, and in September, he was convicted of 13 murders and a variety of other crimes. Nearly 2 months later, he was sentenced to death, with a judge stating that his crimes showed cruelty, callousness, and viciousness beyond any human understanding. Ramirez never expressed remorse, and after receiving his sentence, he stated, big deal, death always went with the territory. Richard Ramirez died of complications secondary to B-cell lymphoma at Marin General Hospital in Green Bay, California, on June 7, 2013. He had also been affected by chronic substance abuse and chronic hepatitis C viral infection. He was 53.